apparent lack of evidence, any evidence that isn't there that they think should be, is to them conclusive proof of both conspiracy and cover-up. And since, once again, in a complex case like this, many discrepancies are inevitable, they have plenty to work with too. May I say that both faiths are very ably represented on this panel, but I do not happen to belong to either one. Now, I first became involved in this as a scholar on the 20th anniversary when I was commissioned to write a long piece for the Sunday section of the Washington Post about the assassination. And at that time, I took an agnostic position on the key issues, but I was already quite impressed by the conclusions of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, namely that the president was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy involving organized crime figures. For the rest of the 80s and the 90s, I wrote books on other topics, but then in the 90s, thanks to the JFK Records Act, we had a massive, unprecedented, and probably never to be repeated release of documents from the FBI, from the CIA, and from the Assassinations Committee, and that was an opportunity I could not resist. And I went into that archive beginning in 2001, determined to find out what I could about the broader context within which the assassination took place. I haven't read more of that archive than any person I know, but I think I did, with the help of some assistants, read more of it than any author. And here are my conclusions, which are similar to, but much more specific than, those of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. President Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy of leading organized crime figures, including, certainly, Sandro Trafficante, the mob boss of North Florida, who had previously owned many of the casinos in Havana, Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, and very possibly, though not certainly, Sam Giancana of Chicago. Those mobsters were part of a broad network, including not only mob bosses, but many anti-Castro Cuban refugees, American mercenaries who worked with those refugees, and American right-wing activists, some of them leading business figures. In saying that, I want to make it very clear that I am not saying that everyone in the network was involved in the assassination. It is only certain organized crime figures who can be directly tied to it. There are plenty of suspects among the other groups, but nothing conclusive, and actually I think it was a relatively small group that actually knew what was up. That network had been formed during the Batista era in Cuba, when American mobsters were busily turning Havana into the Las Vegas of the East Coast. After Castro took power, it shifted its base of operations to the US and began to focus on Castro's overthrow. And Miami, New Orleans, and Dallas were all centers of network activity of many ways, of many kinds. Crucially, the network was enlisted in 1960 by the Central Intelligence Agency under the Eisenhower administration to assassinate Fidel Castro. Three major mob figures, Trafficante, Giancana, and Marcello, were involved in that effort, and as I have said, at least two of them were later involved in the assassination of JFK. I also do not believe, by the way, that anybody from the CIA was involved in the assassination, although CIA people worked with key figures of in the network all the time on the assassination of Castro in particular. Now, the motive for the assassination was Robert Kennedy's all-out attack on organized crime. This had become the major crusade of Robert Kennedy's life in the 50s when he was the counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee, and it was his absolute top priority as Attorney General. Carlos Marcello and Sam Giancana were among his major targets. He came into office in January, and by April, Marcello, thanks to Robert Kennedy, had been deported from the United States, kidnapped basically New Orleans and deported, although he managed to sneak back into the country a few months later. Kennedy then started a prosecution of Marcello for having submitted false documentation, and that prosecution, believe it or not, ended with Marcello's acquittal in New Orleans on the morning of November 22nd, 1963. Sam Giancana was another leading target who was ceaselessly harassed by the FBI and who the Justice Department thought they had nailed on a wiretapping charge involving his girlfriend, the singer Phyllis McGuire, in 1962, but Robert Kennedy was appalled to discover that he was going to have to drop that charge because of Gianconda's involvement in the CIA assassination plot against Castro. Now both Marcello and Trafficante were also major allies of Jimmy Hoffa, Kennedy's other major target. And indeed, in May 1963, Hoffa sent Frank Regano, a Florida lawyer who worked for both Hoffa and Trafficante, to meet with Marcello and Trafficante in New Orleans and to tell them that the time had come to kill John Kennedy. Now, you may be wondering, why kill John Kennedy and not Robert Kennedy? And in fact, it turns out that they had thought about that rather carefully and reached a sensible conclusion. Were they to kill Robert Kennedy, there was a grave danger that the president would send the Army and Marines after them in revenge. But if they killed the president, Lyndon Johnson would take over. Everyone knew that he and Robert Kennedy were, to put it mildly, not close. And RFK would lose his influence and probably his job, and some of the heat would come off. And that is, in fact, exactly what did happen in the years immediately after the assassination. Meanwhile, many anti-Castro Cubans and their American supporters were increasingly angry at President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis had failed to result in the removal of Fidel Castro. And by 1963, right-wing anti-Castro Cubans and their American allies, all this is detailed at great length in my book, were convinced either that JFK would never do anything against Fidel Castro, or that, if he did, he would replace him with another relatively left-wing Cuban leader from the exile community who wouldn't be any more to their liking either. And as a matter of fact, about that, they were absolutely right. That was the goal towards which the administration and the CIA were working during 1963. However, although there are certain anti-Castro groups and individual figures who have been linked to the assassination and who certainly are logical suspects, there is no one about whom I can definitely say that they were involved. Now, what about Oswald and Ruby? And I want to stress that in the limited time I have, I'm only giving you very key facts, and if there are things you want me to elaborate on, please let me do so later on. Well, Oswald had connections to the Marcello mob going back to his childhood in New Orleans. He had an uncle whom he reestablished contact with in 1963, who was a bookmaker in the Marcello organization, and his mother also consorted with men who were part of that organization. I am also convinced, as I explain at length in the book, that after Oswald returned from the Soviet Union in 1962, he somehow became involved with right-wing activists in Dallas and New Orleans, and in fact became part of an ongoing FBI COINTELPRO effort to discredit the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which I discovered was definitely going on at that time. And that is what his phony chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans was about. Again, I am not suggesting that Oswald was being directed personally by anybody in the FBI. Much of the COINTEL program was subcontracted, indeed, to private right-wing groups, and that, I think, was what was happening in this case. I am also convinced that when, after the Fair Play for Cuba Committee episode, Oswald went to Mexico City in September of 1963 to try to get into Cuba, he was trying to get into Cuba to make yet another assassination attempt on Fidel Castro. One of my major findings, by the way, is that the assassination plots against Castro run by the CIA and others were much more numerous than had been revealed by the investigations in the 1970s. When Oswald couldn't get into Cuba because he couldn't get to Mexico, he went back to Dallas, and he got the assignment to kill JFK instead. As for Ruby, he had been associated with mob figures all his life, and his strip club was undoubtedly a mob-controlled enterprise. Dallas, in the organized crime world, was a subsidiary of New Orleans, where Carlos Marcello was the boss. Ruby talked for months before the assassination about all the trouble he was having with the American Guild of Variety Artists, the union to which his strippers belonged. Even though there was an investigation of that union that year, most people haven't understood what he was talking about. That union did absolutely nothing for the young women who belonged to it except collect dues. It was a mob-controlled outfit that existed for the purpose of extorting money from club owners, like Ruby. In other words, Ruby was short in his payments to his mob bosses He didn't know what to do, and this left him in a vulnerable position. But I now am going to go to the key evidence in the conspiracy itself. The critical figure in making the assassination happen was an associate of the Trafficante family named John Martino. He had worked in Havana casinos for Trafficante. He was arrested in Havana in 1959 for trying to smuggle some of Trafficante's money out, although he was charged with something else. And he was sentenced to a long prison term. Somehow, he managed to get out of prison in 1962. At that time, by the way, in 1959, Trafficante was also in a detention camp in Cuba, and he received a visit in September of 1959 in that camp from none other than Jack Ruby, who had made a short trip to Havana at that time. When Martino got out of prison and returned to Florida in 1962, he immediately became very active in the whole network again. He acquired a right-wing ghostwriter, Nathan Weil, and he wrote a book called I Was Castro's Prisoner. And then in May of 1963, he organized, with the help of the Miami CIA station and staffers of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, and William Pauley, a industrialist, a transportation magnate also, yet another assassination attempt on Castro, which was known as the Bio-Pauley Raid. And according to a mercenary named Loren Hall, who we'll come back to, who was also in the detention camp with Trafficante in 1959, both Sam Giancana and Trafficante were involved in financing that raid. It was sold to the CIA with a cover story involving potential Soviet defectors, but it is clear that it was designed to send a group into Cuba with some equipment to try to blow up Fidel. As it happened, the boat that they sent apparently sank, and the men never reached Cuba. Martino then went on a book tour promoting his book, visiting both New Orleans and Dallas in September and around October 1st of 1963. And 3 weeks later, he went back to Dallas for reasons that have never been explained. We then come to Loren Hall, the mercenary I just mentioned, who had been involved in the planning of the Bio-Pauley raid, and he was also in Dallas with another man, Larry Howard, in late September and early October of 1963. This was one of a number of trips that Hall made to Dallas in 1963, usually to raise money for anti-Castro Cuban activities. On October 3rd, I can now say with greater certainty than I did in the book, a left-wing refugee in Dallas named Sylvia Odio, left-wing Cuban refugee, was visited by two mercenaries claiming to be Cubans and friends of her father's, and a young American who said very little, whom they called Leon. And they asked her for help raising money, and she was non-committal. A day or two later, their leader, who had called himself Leopoldo, and I'm almost sure was Loren Hall, called her to talk about, as he put it, the American who had been with them. And he asked her if she could help smuggle this American into Cuba, because he was the kind of guy who might take a shot at Castro. He also mentioned that the American, whom he called Leon, had said that the Cubans should have shot JFK after the Bay of Pigs. Again, Sylvia Odio was non-committal and said she didn't know how to smuggle somebody into Cuba. When she first saw Oswald on television after the assassination, she immediately recognized that it was the Leon who had visited her. It took the Warren Commission a long time to get around to her. She gave her story to the FBI less than a month after the assassination, but they dropped the ball. When she finally testified to Warren Commission staffers, among other things, she tried to get them interested in John Martino, but they didn't pick up the bait. I now cut back to Martino and to the Martino household in Miami Beach, where Martino, his wife, and his 17-year-old son, Edward, were news junkies who watched both Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley every night. And one night in the weeks before the assassination, one of the broadcasts made a reference to Kennedy's forthcoming trip to Texas. If he goes to Dallas, John Martino said, they're going to kill him. I have that from Ed Martino, who came forward with it, not to me, but I've talked to him at great length some years ago. He is now a psychologist and a consultant living in Houston. He's a very responsible guy, and he sat on this for 40 years. But this was confirmed also to 2 other researchers by Martino's widow before she died. In addition, on the morning of the 22nd, at breakfast, John Martino looked at his son and said, "Ed, you don't look very well to me today. I think you ought to stay home from school. I'll be out working in the garage. Could you keep track of the news and let me know if anything happens?" At around noon, he did let him know that something had happened, and Martino immediately went into the house and began making phone calls around the country, trying to link Oswald to Fidel Castro. Later, he tried to link Ruby to Fidel Castro as well, but this was unsuccessful. Martino died in 1975, but before his death, he talked about his role in the assassination to at least 2 other men. One was John Cummings, a Newsweek reporter who he had known for many years and who I was able to interview. And he simply said that he had put it together and that any Castro Cubans had been involved. The other was a business partner named Fred Clausen, who unfortunately was dead by the time I got on the trail, but Clausen had called the House Assassinations Committee late in the 70s and tried to, and tipped them off anonymously about Martino and about this. And Martino told him that Oswald was supposed to have gone to a rendezvous after the assassination where he would have been assassinated and his body would have disappeared. And I am positive that had that happened, there would have been rumors, as there were anyway, actually, that he had been flown to Mexico City and then to Cuba in an effort to provoke an invasion of Cuba. The great irony is that although a lot of the leading figures in the administration did suspect that Cuba was behind the assassination, nobody ever wanted to pursue that. As it was, Ruby had to be recruited, and he stalked Oswald all weekend using his police connections in the police station, and he was recruited to kill him. In the mid-70s, when the revelations about the anti-Castro plots first came out, it seemed that the story might break, and the Church Committee, the Senate Committee, was getting fairly close. But Sam Giancana was the victim of a mob hit before he could testify before the Church Committee. That was virtually the same month that Jimmy Hoffa disappeared as well. And a year later, another key mobster in the story, Johnny Roselli, who had confided to Jack Anderson that the mob might have been behind the assassination. He went before the Church Committee, not for the first time, and he finally linked Trafficani to the assassination plots against Castro. He disappeared a month later, and his body was found floating in an oil drum in Miami Beach sometime after that. Lastly, in April 1977, a tabloid reporter called Lauren Hall, the mercenary I've referred to, at his home in California and tried to interview him. And the tabloid reporter recorded the conversation and turned the transcript over to the House Committee later. Hall was very abusive and hostile and declined to say anything, but at the end of the interview, he made an interesting remark. Quote, "Hey man, right as it stands now, there's only 2 of us left alive. That's me and Senator Trafficante. And as far as I'm concerned, we're both going to stay alive because I ain't gonna say shit." Trafficante and Marcello both died in bed, but not before they had indicated their role in the plot privately, at least once each. Now, as I say, I had only 20 minutes. I hope I stayed within it, and I had to stress the main points. The book fills in the details on these matters and a great many more, and I'll be glad to try to fill them up in questions. I wanted to see if the truth was out there. I concluded that it was, but I've discovered in this, as in many other controversial issues, while there is a market for the truth out there, it's a specialty market. Thank you very much.
Next up is Professor David Rowan from the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point. He's the author of the Zapruder film, Reframing JFK's Assassination, and we're very privileged to have him here. He's a legendary teacher and scholar in Wisconsin and beyond.
Yeah, beyond. Thanks, Doug, and thanks again, Jim Giglio, for putting this together, and all of you at Missouri. Well, I approach this quite differently. Thanks, Max. Any assassination, and in particular the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, has two components. The first one is it is a simple murder that must be investigated as any ordinary crime to define the facts. It is largely answering to the question of what happened to President Kennedy. On the other hand, it is simultaneously a political act, a violent change in government that basically answers the question of who shot him. The only clear and solid answer to the imperative who rests squarely on the proper and exhaustive definition of what happened to President Kennedy. Knowledge of the crime shall forever govern the political resolution. In Dallas, the Dallas police gave an almost immediate solution to his murder, as Professor McKnight has so aptly shown us. And within 2 hours, they had announced the arrest of the assassin and named him as Lee Harvey Oswald. But within an hour of the murder, in Washington, D.C. on the Potomac River, J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in his office, without his handlers present, in an emotional state, declared to Justice Department officials that a lone assassin had killed John Kennedy, and within 2 hours had identified him as Lee Harvey Oswald. By mid-afternoon, the Secret Service in Dallas had concluded it was a lone assassin. 2 hours and 45 minutes after the murder, Air Force One left Dallas with JFK's body. En route, over its communication system, came the network news announcing Lee Harvey Oswald, a radical and a defector to the Soviet Union, had killed President Kennedy. In the evening, most of the intelligentsia of the Eastern Coast, those are professors, college deans, key newspaper editors, and the like, had embraced that finding. President Lyndon Johnson, in concert with acting Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach and Director Hoover, would, on early Sunday afternoon, conclude that Oswald was solely guilty and agreed on an investigation by men of unimpeachable character to make the evidence show it. Within a minute after the last shot had been fired, police had rushed into the depository building. But incredibly, although they claimed otherwise, they never sealed the building or the plaza crime scene, although the Warren Commission would concur with their top officers by saying that they had not only sealed it, but had closely guarded the building. The head of the Dallas Secret Service, for example, returned to the Dealey Plaza at 1 o'clock, and he went into the depository building, and he found that it was wide open, no guards anywhere. And newsmen and citizens crowded into the building, Roy Truly, the manager of the building, said. And one television reporter had his camera held for him on occasion by police officers as he filmed the search of the 6th floor. In the crowd of the traipsing unknown, evidence could have been tampered with, tainted, or planted, and the culprits could have slipped out. As for the plaza, it was never sealed either. Cars continued down Elm Street. The parking lots emptied. The crowd trampled sites where citizens had reported bullets had ruffled the grass. Not only was the plaza area not sealed, it was neither searched nor protected. There were 2 grassy knolls, 2 parking lots, scores of automobiles, 4 streets, and several grass areas, and a variety of architectural ornaments. The importance of this failure can be illustrated quite clearly. 29 hours after the murder of President Kennedy, a visiting college student on the plaza found 25 feet south of the place where John Kennedy had been hit in the head a piece of his skull glistening in the grass. And he picked that up, and it turned out a forensic radiologist studied that, and by the configurations of the skull and other aspects, determined that it could only have come from an impact from the grassy knoll area, or from the front right. Another illustration was citizens found on the North Elm Street walk a 6-inch long bullet scar, 1/4 of an inch deep, and its trough had lead in it. And that disappears from the evidentiary base. There were only 3 shots in the official scenario, and of those 3 shots, none of them would comport to the location or the nature of that one on Elm Street sidewalk. When the police reached the 6th floor of the Dallas, Texas School Book Depository, they discovered in the southeastern corner a window partially opened, 3 6.5 millimeter shells uniformly laying on its floor, 2 inches apart, all with their heads pointed the same way, and a number of book boxes that they asserted the assassin set upon while firing at President Kennedy. Also, they claimed to have found a large paper bag on the floor near the window that they stated the assassin used to hold a rifle dissembled in order to sneak it into the depository. At 1:22 p.m., they searched the 6th floor, and they found inside a wall of boxes a 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano rifle. The police announced, as in an epiphany, that the southeast corner was the exclusive site used by the lone assassin. It was a fairy tale. Ballistic tests had not been performed on the victims. Not even the number of wounds or their location or their nature on their bodies were known. Photographs had not been assembled or looked at. In fact, the police, the FBI, and the Warren Commission shied away from those photographs. And some of them were quite important. For example, one by a citizen, a slide, showed that the first shot in the official scenario that hit John Kennedy would have had to have come through the foliage of trees, which could not have happened. What to make of that assassin's lair? The official photograph of the window opening shows a rifle could not have been fired from it and hit the limousine 60 feet below without firing through 2 panes of glass, and the windows were unbroken. Throughout the afternoon, the police calmly raised and lowered the window while they decided on what frame would be best for the official scenario. Tests later showed that the 3 shells had been also inserted and ejected from an entirely different Carcano, evidence of conspiracy completely ignored by investigating officials. Moreover, the rifle was not swabbed to see if in fact it had been fired that day, nor had the shells been tested to see if they had been fired recently. But the police lab found that Oswald's palm print was indeed discovered on the rifle barrel. When they took off the wooden stock, they said his palm print was there. But the print was flat, the barrel round. More than that, at Oswald's arrest, the police took his palm print for identification purposes, and they took multiple copies of the print, and their number and their chain of possession were never known, and it's quite possible the police could have submitted a duplicate as if from the rifle. Moreover, one of the FBI lab and ballistics experts, now these are some of the world's finest scientists, testified